My name is Andy Ingall. I work for Reimagine, which is a non-for-profit that sparks conversations around end of life, death and dying, caregiving, mortality. And we are so honored to be co-hosting this event with Rattlestick Playwrights Theater. Daniela Topol, my colleague, is on the call. Stacey Abramson from Reimagine is also on the call with me, and I want to thank you both for making this happen and asking me to facilitate this conversation. I also want to thank our speakers, who you'll hear more from in a bit. I'm going to be asking them to say a few words about themselves. But first, I want to light this candle. This is something that actually I learned from Rattlestick. I attended a beautiful play about a year ago called Novenas for a Lost Hospital, which was about St. Vincent's Hospital as the epicenter of the cholera epidemic in the late 19th century, and also the epidemic of AIDS in the 80s and 90s. And as part of the production, we all lit a candle. And I want to do that today in honor of some of the loved ones of our panelists who died from COVID-19. And I encourage you all to put into the chat someone's name who you lost. Thank you. So there are a number of questions that I'm hoping we can dig into today. We only have about an hour, so we'll do the best we can. The whole point of this program is to explore how we mourn lives during the pandemic. And I also wanted to provide this opportunity to shine a light on the last responders, the clergy, the death care professionals who are navigating the challenges of virtual end-of-life ceremonies at this time of social distancing. I've been having this experience where I've been going out onto my balcony at 7 o'clock and I'm clapping for the essential workers. And I do applaud the physicians, the nurses, the grocery workers, but I'm not sure if we're all applauding for the undertakers, the morticians, the clergy, the rabbis, the priests, the imams who are having to hold the grief of so many at this time. So that's one area that I want to explore with all of you today. And we're also going to hear the stories of some of our guest speakers who had their own personal losses due to COVID-19. And we'll also give them an opportunity to share their experience of virtual rituals for end of life. I also have this question, which was deeply informed by both our panelists, Reverend Lisa Jenkins and Arielle Goldberg. What is required of all of us to ensure that there's justice and equity, not just for the living, but also for the dead? And finally, I hope we can get into some resources and wisdom and action steps for those who are mourning and those who are celebrating lives at this time and going forward. I'm now going to ask all of our panelists to do some brief introductions, and then we'll hear a reading from our esteemed actor, Keith, at the very end. So maybe Lisa, you could start.
Hi, good afternoon. And thank you so much, Andy, and for Rattlestick for convening this gathering. My name is Reverend Dr. Lisa Jenkins. I'm the senior pastor of the St. Matthew's Baptist Church of Harlem, 95-year-old congregation. Excited to be the first woman to be pastoring them. Also an adjunct lecturer with the City University of New York, where I teach multicultural studies. And I'm also just formed my own company, LDJ Global Connections, where I help organizations understand that there is strength in the diversity of their organizations. So we deal with unconscious bias, diversity, inclusion, as well as a number of other matters. And so again, my biography, I think, is somewhere there in the invitation that everyone received. You can read more there as well as on my website. But again, thank you for allowing me to be a part of this fantastic and much needed conversation.
Our pleasure, Lisa. You are also an alumna of Reimagine. You presented at the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2018 when we had our in-person New York Festival. It's great to have you back. Next up, Bob, can you please say a few words?
This is Bob Lomison. I'm the chairman of the board of a corporation that owns and operates cemeteries, funeral homes, and crematories, mostly based in the states of Louisiana and Texas. And I'm also a member of the Rattlestick Board of Directors.
Thank you, Bob. Ariel.
Hi, everyone. My name is Arielle Goldberg. I'm a writer and a curator and a teacher. And I'm joining to talk about also how I lost my uncle Irving from COVID. And yeah, and I organized a Zoom Shiva, coming from a Jewish background of grief and mourning for my family in April.
Thank you, Ariel. Keith, could you say a few words about yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Keith Randolph Smith, and I'm an actor, and I was recently at the Rattlestick Theater Company doing a play by the writer Corey Thomas. It was called Lockdown, and dealt with the prison system and parole, especially with older incarcerated folks. And it was a wonderful experience for me, very eye-opening, and a chance to touch a lot of different areas in the community. So I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Keith, could you go ahead with the reading, please?
Absolutely. I have a reading here from playwright August Wilson, and it's from one of his plays called Two Trains Running. I'll bury anything with anybody. You'd be surprised what people want in a casket with them. I done buried people with Bibles, canes, crutches, guitars, radios, baby dolls. One lady brought some tomatoes from her sister's garden. She didn't just want me to put them in there. She wanted to tell me where to put them. That wouldn't have been so bad, but she kept changing her mind. People something. They don't understand about dead folks. Dead folks don't know nothing. They don't know them tomatoes is in there with them, but the family know. That's who it's important to. Took me a while to figure that out. I don't mind putting anything in there with anybody as long as the casket closed. But most time, the family come and get the money before they close the casket, take off the rings and everything else. I hate to even lay people out with jewelry, because the family come and remind you every day that it ain't supposed to go in the ground. See, I done buried a whole lot of people, but my wife was the first one I ever wondered if she was in heaven. See, people don't understand about death, but if you ever hear one of them coffin sounds, you know, there ain't nothing like it. That coffin get to talking, and you know that this what we call life, ain't nothing. You can blow it away with a blink of an eye, but death, you can't blow away death. It lasts forever. I didn't understand about it till my wife died. Before that, it was just a job. Then when she died, I come to understand it. You can live to be 150 and you'll never have a greater moment than when you breathe your last breath. Ain't nothing you can do in life compared to it. See, right then, you done something. You became a part of everything that come before, and that's a great thing. Ain't nothing you can do in life compared to that. Thank you.
Bravo, Keith. Thank you. There's so much richness in Wilson's text and in your delivery. And what stood out for me, I think, was this idea that dead folks don't know nothing, but the family know. That's who it's important to. This idea that funerals are really for the living. And I'm curious to hear from our salon speakers, from your perspective as clergy, as death care professionals, as a person who organized a virtual funeral. Can we talk more about this idea of these celebrations of life? Lisa, maybe you can kick us off.
Yes, unmuting. Thank you so much. Again, that was awesome, Keith. Thank you so much for that reading. Very moving. Yeah, one of the things that we say in our tradition is from the Bible, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And so we acknowledge and believe, I'll say that, that the person really is not there. Their spirit is gone. What's there, we often say, is a shell. It's the body. It is that which has encased the soul, the spirit throughout the lifetime. And with that in mind, we know that the person has gone on to someplace, we often say, far better than what we're dealing with here in whatever present we are in. And so the idea of funerals and rituals, which was just read, the idea of putting things in the casket, that's a ritual that will carry on with when you put the tomatoes or the jewelry or what have you in the casket. That's something that lets the living know that there's a part of them that's going with them. So while we believe that there is an afterlife for the deceased, that connection of putting something in the casket gives us that consolation that part of us will be with the person even as they transition to another place. Reminds me of when my mother died, my son placed his report card. He was 15 at the time, and he had a pretty decent report card. And so he placed it in the casket with my mother, his grandmother, so that he would have a connection with her.
Beautiful. Ariel, maybe you could chime in here a bit too about, having just organized a Shiva for your uncle, the types of rituals that you incorporated into that. And I'm curious too, like, how does one create a sense of intimacy in this virtual space?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And also, Keith, for that reading. It reminded me very viscerally of being at my aunt's funeral just 2 years ago. And she was very much like a student of Jewish, like everything, culture, theological texts, religion. It was she was also an early education, special education developer of curricular materials. And she was very close with my uncle. They would often go to services together. And when she was at her funeral, when she was buried, she wanted to be buried with like Jewish texts, like these books of hers. And I remember it was that the view of the books being put in to the ground, like that image really haunted me. And it was actually, the way that I understood it was like asking me to take her the ways that I connected with her as like a student of Jewish law and life, and think about how I can make Jewish traditions a part of my life, as somebody who has, you know, grew up sort of like Reconstructionist secular Jewish in New Jersey, got bat mitzvahed, worked at my Hebrew school, and had been pretty absent from Jewish traditions. At my aunt's funeral, I actually was asked to write a eulogy, which is sort of like a theme that I've been thinking about a lot right now during a time of crisis, of social crisis, is to think about like what skills I have. So like as a writer, I was able to kind of write something that was crafted in a way that also was a way for me to announce myself to my family. Because I'm queer and trans and like an artist, I like don't really fall into these legible ways of like, you know, like I don't believe in, or I don't want to get married and I don't want to have kids. Like I'm just sort of have other forms of like family and things. So, you know, mourning my uncle, it was a call taken from my aunt where it was sort of like, okay, what skills do I have? I have a Zoom account because I teach at the new school. You know, I can contact family members and bring them together because I have experiences with curating. And it felt like if I wasn't going to do it, then we weren't going to have any like ritual, Jewish ritual for my uncle. And because he didn't have children, and his surviving spouse, my aunt, also was not in the place to organize anything. So it felt like because I wasn't, you know, I was like, you know, mourning the loss of my uncle continues to be hard, but I wasn't like his partner. So it wasn't as hard. So kind of stepping in, yeah, and it's weird. A Shiva is not a funeral, but because there was no funeral, it sort of became the funeral. And so, you know, ways that we created intimacy in the call was like recalling memories about Irving. He was a high school teacher, math teacher in the Bronx, born and raised in the Bronx, and lived in Queens, not far from me. So yeah, it was really painful to witness people grieving under these circumstances where we couldn't be together. But I think there were aspects to it where a lot of times with these Zoom events, I think it's important that we gather because it makes us feel a little more connected when we're going through these hard times together. So
I had this experience of my first Zoom Shiva back in March, and this was for a friend who actually works for the synagogue that I belong to. And it was a terrible, terrible feeling not being able to see him and give him a hug. I'm really longing for that right now, like so many of us. But what I thought was, you know, there may have been like this little silver lining with this Zoom Shiva experience, is that people from his life from all over the world, he's originally from Venezuela, there were people from all over the world participating in this Zoom call. And I thought that was touching and remarkable. Bob, maybe you could share with us some of the shifts that you've seen in the funeral industry and the reports you're getting from funeral directors about how they are supporting families right now.
We've worked very hard during this period because of the many state restrictions, limiting the number of folks that could participate in the actual funeral, whether it be the memorial or at the cemetery, to try to create a meaningful experience for the family. So many of us in the industry have offered videos service free of charge to families as part of their ceremony, so that we could still have a celebration of life. And some of the best examples that we did it, we still continued with our ability to transform chapels and or viewing areas into tributes to the loved one. For example, we had a fisherman that died, and he was a sport fisherman that participated in a competition, and we brought in his reels and rods, and as well as his boat. He had a small boat that he went out in the lake and fished out of And we had those all on display in the chapel and videoed it with the few family members that were able to participate. But because folks could join us from anywhere, it created a meaningful celebration of his life. And so during this period, despite the fact that many of my friends in the industry were overwhelmed in the city of New York, we tried to individualize and serve families as best we could, and continue to make the ceremony meaningful.
Thank you, Bob. I want to go back to one of those original questions that I brought up at the beginning. This idea of what is required of us to ensure that there's justice and equity, not just for the living, but also for the dead. I'm thinking back again to the play I mentioned at the beginning that Rattlestick produced. It was about these two pandemics, cholera and AIDS, but it was also about the pandemics of living in a city where gentrification is running wild, where there is racism. I'd love to hear more from Lisa and Ariel about this idea of the necropolitics of COVID-19.
Yeah, well, the necropolitics, it's something that all of us should be concerned about. A term that was coined by Akile Mbembe in South Africa, and it simply means the control of power, social and political power, that determines who dies and who lives. And so basically that's what we're looking at when we're talking about COVID-19, social and political power that's determining who dies and who lives. And we see that in areas like where I pastor in Harlem, where there is a high rate of individuals who are dying with COVID-like symptoms, but who are not being tested. And so they're being undercounted as far as COVID is concerned, because there's no mechanism or means or any sort of testing facilities above 145th Street currently at this point in time in Upper Harlem. And so those individuals we know have historically not gotten the right, they've not gotten health treatments, they've not gotten any received resources that they should have received. And they've died at a disproportionately high rate from other diseases that have been preventable or manageable. And so now that we have COVID-19, there are other areas and other regions in our city, and I'm talking about New York specifically, I'm sure it's happening all over the country, where people are not getting the appropriate health resources that they should get. I mean, we talk about the justice for those who are dead, because that's talking about those who are living and how we are hastening their deaths because of the social and political factors. But a perfect example is in the Hebrew text, when Ritzpah, who the sons of David and of Samuel were sons of Samuel, and others were put to death by David actually, and were hung and impaled for people to see. But Ritzpah took a stand, and she sat on a rock in front of these 5 bodies, her sons and other sons, and she refused to move over the course of months until those bodies were brought down and given a proper burial by King David. And so that's one of the first acts of social justice that we can see on behalf of the dead, which reflects also on the legacy of those who come after. And so our question for us as we're dealing with necropolitics, as well as dealing with how we are making sure that we do right by those who have died, is what stance are we going to take now for those who are living, for those who are in hospitals and who are sick and who are on the cusp of death, and for those who have already died? What are we going to do for their legacy? Are we going to be bold like Ritzpah and stand on a rock and make sure that we protest until justice is brought to those who have died. That's what she did. And that's, I think, is a prime example for us. How uncomfortable are we willing to be? How are we going to shake ourselves and agitate ourselves and the communities around us so that justice can be brought forth for both the living and for the dead and the legacy to come after?
Ariel, in response to that, what kind of action steps do you think people can do in their own local communities, whether that's Harlem, whether that's in Queens, or elsewhere around the world?
Yeah, I felt really inspired listening to you, Lisa, so thank you for that. I just got back, this past year I was in Tucson, Arizona, and I was working at a Jewish History Museum and Holocaust History Center. And now that I'm back in Queens, I'm thinking a lot about what I learned, especially from local border activists in the Southwest who, between Mariposas and Fronteras, which serves LGBTQ people inside of detention centers, and No More Deaths, which brings like water to people who are crossing the border. I learned a lot about like activists that don't even call themselves activists, because that in and of itself is a self-aggrandizing term. They're more thinking, of themselves as volunteers, and it's sort of anonymous work. And I feel really lucky that I was able to see kind of like be in a city that isn't as expensive as New York City, and so people have more free time to do more volunteer work for various local organizations. All of the sort of diseases and the crises that COVID is laying bare and exacerbated by this were, predate this health crisis. And I think there's a sort of, I'm trying to think about how to be uncomfortable and change my life and devote more of my time to, local grassroots political campaigns. Like I have a friend who's a poet whose name I can put in the chat, is running for state assembly. I didn't even know what state assembly was before Joey DeJesus explained it to me. So it's like, this is like ultra local political stuff. So the situation that, I am infuriated and terrified, especially with like the white nationalist militias that are, ever since Charlottesville happened in 2017, I feel like are only increasingly becoming congratulated by 45 and the person, with a shit ton of power, is just like, I want to think about what's like as close to home as possible for me. So that is like, phone banking for Joey DeJesus's District 38 campaign. I'm in a district right next to the one that they're running for state assembly, but I've been, still calling my neighbors. And I think that is really uncomfortable. It's weird to call people on a Democratic Party phone log and people hang up on you and it's awkward. But that level of discomfort is, I think, not dissimilar to like, figuring out ways that I can, luckily if I stay employed as an adjunct, save money so that I can donate it, every month to people who are undocumented, who are not getting even the measly, government funds. So it's a sort of like a consortium of efforts of really trying to tap into community-based organizers who have been doing a lot of this work already, that are making very clear asks, and just if people are new to organizing. And the people on this call who are community-based organizers and have been doing the work, I hope also that more people join into your efforts and that you can rest and recuperate, because I think burnout on the part of community-based organizers is really real, especially now when everyone's dealing with a lot more stress and grieving. I have found that people are not really, and why this panel is so important, is like people are not really integrating the language of grief and the experience of grief even into their daily lives of how they present their lives through social media in this moment. So
I want to encourage folks, if you have questions that you want to ask, please put them in the chat and we will get to our Q&A soon. I do want to keep going a little bit with this issue of equity with Bob, because one thing that I've been hearing from some communities is, in many communities, that people cannot afford funerals right now. And I know that the funeral industry has stepped up with support through a foundation that has been set up for people. What do you do in situations when people can't afford to bury or cremate their loved ones? How is the funeral industry responding now?
Well, one of the things that we've seen during this period is the community, churches, and families are really working together to a larger extent than ever in the past, because of the very nature of the emergency or the time frame when a death has occurred. We're finding that the collection of the fees, and every business has fees, and so the death care industry is no different. But we found that many of the churches stepped up to assist members of their church. We saw community groups come in. We saw family members. At one meeting, there were 12 credit cards being passed around to be used to pay for the services. And during this period too, for example, the video broadcasting we provided free of charge, which normally pre-COVID was a service charge that was available to the families to choose if they wanted to broadcast. But we included that in our fees and provided it free of charge. So we went out of our way, and we worked with families to do GoFundMes. And it is amazing also how much money was raised from some families by using that mechanism, because I wasn't really familiar with it before. But we didn't. Again, I do a lot of business in Louisiana and Texas. I'm the second largest provider of African American burials in the state of Louisiana, and so we cross many economic lines, and we really didn't encounter too many challenges in that area. But where we did, we were available to assist. And the cremation rate did not really increase as you might expect. Some folks select cremation as a less expensive alternative, but our numbers remained pretty steady as they would have pre-COVID. So it will be interesting to see what happens post-COVID.
Bob, I appreciated before what you shared on an earlier call that we had, that this experience has transformed you more than being just a bean counter, in your industry. Yeah. That the funeral work, your funeral directors have really changed you. I do want to just go back to Lisa before we open this up, because Lisa, we talked about this before, and you are a pastor, you are giving care to so many of your congregants, and you were hit by this devastating loss of your partner of 11 years. I would love for you to just share how one manages, at this time, both feeling the need to serve your flock and to serve yourself, and when to know that you need to step back and take care of yourself.
That's a difficult question to answer, honestly, because I come from a background and from a history of people who have really borne a lot of weight over the centuries and over the decades and over the years and days. And it's something that has been passed down, I think, from generation to generation, which is why I'm here. There are others who went through some things and did not survive, but those like me that remain are those who understand what resilience really is. And so this whole idea of what it has meant to me and how we've gone through it, and having lost someone close to me, a partner of 11 years, and still having to write sermons, and still having to minister to others, and still having to watch colleagues who are pastors dying of COVID, and their spouses and family members dying of COVID. I press through knowing that there is a tomorrow. I press through, and this might sound, I don't know if it sounds simplistic or if it sounds trite or if it's, I don't know, but I do know that I have come from a heritage that has always relied on the fact that those who came before us went through some horrific situations. And because we're still here, we too can go through some situations as well. And so some of the things that we're dealing with COVID, it reminds me that in 19 what, well, I wasn't around in 1918 or whatever, but I do know the history that there was a pandemic and people got through it. How do I know? Because we are still here. I know that even before that, that my own ancestors were snatched from the motherland and brought here in the belly of ships, and many died. Many were thrown overboard, many escaped, others were butchered and raped, but I'm still here. So there were those who survived. And I know that even today, I have to continue to agitate the waters. That's how clean clothes get clean. Okay, they go in a washing machine. And there's a thing that we don't talk about, but it's called an agitator. That's what it's really called. And it agitates the dirty clothes so that they can become clean. So I come from a long line of people that look like me, sound like me, that are used to agitating the dirty waters and the dirty clothing of this country. And so even though, in the words of Fannie Lou Hamer, who said, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, as she said at that Democratic National Convention in 1960, whatever it was, I stand here today saying that I must minister to those who have been hurt by COVID because loved ones have died. That I have to continue ministering. I have to continue writing sermons. I have to continue with Bibles. I have to continue because I know that after this, there is always victory. After this, however long this occurs, there is a tomorrow. And I know that my plan is to be around to see it. And if not me, then those who come after me, I will have left something for them.
Lisa, please keep agitating because you're inspiring me, and I think you're inspiring all of us to be agitating at your side as we get through this.
Yeah. One quick thing, as far as what Ariel said about the legislative officials and the assembly, I want to encourage everyone to understand how the legislative powers work. It's very important. As an adjunct with CUNY, I was stunned to know that so many of the students, adult students, did not understand how our legislative powers work. The city council in New York, the state assembly, the United States senator as opposed to the state senators, the community boards here in New York City. We must understand, because sometimes we're barking up the wrong tree. And we've got to be able to hit the powers actually where they have the power so that they can be effective and operate on behalf of us so that we can have what we need in our communities and for our people who are dying and who are living.
Thank you. Maybe now it's time to take some questions. Daniela, do you want to feed some to us?
I mean, just sort of on the vein of what we're currently talking about, this question, are there any actions being taken by private or government organizations to celebrate the lives of marginalized and vulnerable populations, trans, POC, and homeless populations? If anyone knows about actions being taken, maybe we can use the chat as a way to share so that this can be a resource sharing place as well.
I was reminded that our federal government has done absolutely nothing in doing any vigil for anyone right now. And it's really up to these smaller private organizations doing this.
So yeah, I think please share. And then I think there's a number of questions that are related that I think all three of you could speak about related to the process of collective grief and grieving. So I'm going to throw out both questions, though they're different, but I think they're a cousin to one another. And I think all three of you probably have things to say about this. Whose death counts and whose death is mourned for people whose lives have been marginalized by racism, incarceration, immigration status, and other injustices? How do we bring respect and collective grief to these deaths? And then related, again, not the same, but how can we encourage each other to recognize different kinds of connections when we can't physically be with loved ones who are dying, sharing with others in that sense, such a sense of powerlessness and loss. So I think both of these questions are circling around how do we as a community respond to those who are dying and those who have died. And any insights that you have on that would probably be very welcome.
I'll speak and say that all deaths count. Whose death counts and whose death is mourned, all deaths count, and all deaths should be mourned. All life is important. We are all, regardless of who we are, created in the image of God. Most of us believe that. Those who don't believe it know still that each life, because it is somehow created, however, is equal to all others and is therefore still important, regardless of one's worldview. And how do we bring respect and collective grief? I would say by speaking up. I would say each of us has an obligation to speak up on behalf of the marginalized, the least of these, as what many of the scriptures say, but who we understand is not the least, but who we understand is our equal. So in prisons, the prison industrial complex, the prison, the private prison system, which is a money-making organization, is a cauldron right now that is boiling over with people who are dying because of COVID, because of the closeness, the proximity of the incarcerated who cannot go anywhere. There are ways for us to find out who these people are. I know on it's either 1010 Wins or 880 here in New York have brought up names of individuals who have died in the prison system, or it could have been CNN, I'm sorry, but it was one of those stations. And so if they could find that out, we could find it out as well. I mean, many of us, we have research skills, we have Google, we can find it out, and we can bring that to the forefront, whether it is on social media, whether it is taking those names to our local legislative officials, which I advise as well as social media, letting them know, the local legislative officials, many of whom are connected with private prison complexes, by the way, but letting them know that we are not going to stand for people who are marginalized, whether they are immigrants, whether they are incarcerated, that we pay attention to them, that we know they exist, and we are here to stand up and be the voice for them because they often cannot be the voice for themselves.
I just want to share one bright light that I'm reminded of. There's a group of women clergy that have been meeting, and one of those women is Reverend Dominique Atchison of the Mayor's Office for Community Affairs. She's the director of the Center for Faith and Community Partnerships. For those who are being buried on Hart Island, New York City's Potter's Field, where folks who usually don't have money and don't have means end up getting buried or unclaimed, there is now an initiative for women clergy to provide rites at end of life via a video conference to the Department of Corrections chaplain who is employed to do this work, but may not be familiar with various faith traditions. So this is a beautiful gesture that's being done. It cannot be recorded, but I want more people to know about it.
Thank you. Leave it to the women clergy.
Were there others, Ariel or Bob? Did you want to respond to those questions as well?
Well, I think that there's, I like to think of as an educator that like reading and staying informed is very important right now, especially when there's so much misinformation for political gain. And it's for people who are on the front lines of, watching this pandemic and feeling it and it reverberating in their personal, social, work lives. It's very obvious that it's real. It's not being made up. Yet really infuriating news is kind of coming through all these platforms. So I began kind of thinking, how can I educate myself about what it's like to be, chronically ill, disabled, immunocompromised, and, how are we all kind of entering that life? And so I think, in terms of honoring people and thinking about who's passing, I also think we have a responsibility to educate ourselves. So there's a really great book that I started reading about, kind of like from the perspective of people who have never been supported by the government and who are always invisible in certain ways. We need to fight for, better social services in this country. And I think that progressive politicians can do that. It's going to take a really long time for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to become president, but I am holding on to the hope that, politicians like her will, be leaders someday. But I started reading a book by Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Singha called Care Work at the beginning of this. That's all about her mutual aid communities that she was a part of in terms of POC, queer, crip activist circles, over the past 20 years. And she's a great voice. I think that the Barnard Center for Research on Women, in terms of how I'm trying to educate myself about people who know a lot about how to sustain and support one another in sort of crisis and where there's a lack of resources. Barnard Center for Research on Women has had really great webinars. Haymarket Books has had really great webinars. Blacklight, the African American Policy Forum, Kimberly Crenshaw hosts these others. Those are three really great webinar resources that I've been looking to that are featuring people who really are at the intersections of all of the ways that COVID is laying bare all these injustices in our society.
Great. And
just want to acknowledge Reimagine's founding board chair, Jeannie Blaustein's on the call. I noticed that she put into the chat that Reimagine having its next vigil on June 9th. For those who have died from COVID-19, it's yet another opportunity to pay tribute to your loved ones and the loved ones that we don't know and that may not have a name. And there is another resource that I can think of right now that Reimagine worked on. It's the COVID-19 white paper, which I think addresses Jan Booth's question here about recognizing different kinds of connection that we can provide one another at this time of social distancing. And it does provide some examples of virtual rituals that can be provided. So I can try to post that in the chat as well.
I guess I'm also curious, just because you all have, there's been this topic is so personal, particularly to Lisa and Ariel, but for all three of you, about what your personal, how what you've learned or how you've changed personally through this, through dealing with loss, what you've learned you need from others, on a really personal, human to human basis as well. Curious if any of the three of you have anything that you want to say about that.
I'm trying to let others speak. I'm a preacher, I can speak. I always have something to say. So I've learned to accept the goodness of others. And when I say that, I mean, I grew up as an only child, and I'm pretty independent, but I've learned to rely on others bringing food to me, even in this sort of isolation. They'll bring it to me, leave it on my, porch bench. And, normally I'll say, oh, I'm fine, I don't need that. But I allow people to help me. My line sisters who have been amazing as far as making sure that I am well fed, well cared for. Church members have reached out. there were a couple of Sundays that I did not have to preach and get a sermon together. And because of this whole virtual services, a friend of mine from Canada preached the word without getting on a plane and coming to New York. So I've allowed people to just be kind, which they always were, but I always was a person that, oh, don't worry, I've got it. I have to realize that I'm human and that I can sit back and say, wow, maybe I do need to just breathe and be still, which is what my partner would have told me. He was a psychotherapist, so his words still reverberate with that.
Yeah,
Ariel,
that's really beautiful to hear. And I think also I had to allow myself, as a sort of a person who likes to always be working and feeling useful, when my uncle passed suddenly, and even the sort of 2 weeks, like organizing around, you know, grieving rituals for my family around it was also very draining. So like giving myself permission to slow down. And I think also in this period of time since then, like really treasuring being alive, and nourishing the relationships that are in my life right now have been really important, and to let people show up for me has been really hard, but also great, I think. And I've like learned and grown a lot. It's hard, it's painful, but I feel like paying attention to the details of everyday life and valuing them also, and thinking about, just like what you were saying, Lisa, about, you know, people survived in order for us to be here, is helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll say also, Daniela, you know, I have making sure that I help others. So I have this whole other thing coming up with Reimagine with Rabbi Jan Urbach, which was actually born out of the grief that I was experiencing, or actually it right before it, because he went into the hospital and others were dying. So there was grief all around me. And so sharing with someone else, or having, I should say, someone else share, someone that I respect and know has a brilliant mind. I don't know if any of you know Jan Urbach, rabbi with New York Theological Seminary, powerhouse. And so I just called her up and asked her, can we do this? Can we get together and talk about what life and death means? Can we talk about Rabbi Kushner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People? Can we talk about this whole theodicy of what's going on in the world? And she said, sure, why not? So I'm excited to just be able to pick her brain. And I believe that healing will come to me as well as so many others who will be able to hear that dialogue and what she has to say during that time.
This is all very powerful and really important for everybody to hear on many levels, the personal and the political. There's a question that I think maybe Bob could field first, and maybe Lisa second, related to your industries or your organizations. As sad as it's been, the sudden norming of the opportunity to participate in a memorial service, a funeral, a shiva, virtually or remotely, has allowed me to join and support friends in a way that I wouldn't previously have been able to. Is there thinking that services retain a virtual dimension post-pandemic? So basically, how will you proceed forward from this? Do you imagine, Bob and Lisa, in terms of your company related to post-COVID? Oh, hold on. Let's unmute you. Sorry. Go ahead, Bob.
Pardon?
Sorry, you were muted. Go ahead.
Oh, that I think it's a very interesting question, and my colleague and I have had some discussions on this very idea. Around 10 years ago, we equipped many funeral homes with the ability to broadcast memorial services. And we had very few families select that option. Very few families were interested in doing it. And we kind of took it off of our radar and didn't, it was on our general price list and it was available to families, but we really didn't emphasize it so much. And so when the crisis started and it became the best alternative for families, and families have been very appreciative of having this type of service available. We're really curious to see if, as the doors open and more families can participate in the service and friends, whether or not folks will want to continue with the virtual broadcast or the virtual ceremony. We think it's going to continue because it is a great way for friends and relatives that live distances to participate in a ceremony without the expense of travel and without the expense of time from work, and still provide emotional and support and love to a loved one. And so we think it is going to continue in the same way. And so we're gearing up to continue it as just an additional free part of your selection process when you're making arrangements at a funeral home or cemetery, because we've done both. We broadcast both from the funeral home and from the cemetery, and we're finding it to be a big success in terms of being able to reach out to others.
Mm-hmm.
Before we end with Keith's final reading from Fences by August Wilson, I just want to thank Rattlestick again. I want to thank Lisa, Ariel, Bob, Keith, for allowing us to partner with you. This was such a beautiful event. I want to plug Rattlestick's event next week, where they will be focusing on health workers and COVID-19. It's another partnership with Reimagine. And please check out the other links that we've posted in the chat, particularly Lisa's event that's coming up and other programs. So thanks again to everyone who joined us today. And now I will hand this over to Keith.
Unmute. This is from August Wilson's play Fences, the character of Troy. Death ain't nothing. I done seen him. You can't tell me nothing about death. Death ain't nothing but a fastball on the outside corner, and you know what I'll do to that. Look here, Bono, am I lying? You get one of them fastballs right over the outside corner of the plate where you can get the meat of the bat on it, and good God, you can kiss it goodbye. Now, am I lying? If I'm lying, that's 450 feet worth of line. That's all death is to me, a fastball on the outside corner. Ain't that right, Bono? See, you worried, but I ain't worried about death. I done seen him, done wrestled with him. Look here, Bono, I looked up one day and death was marching straight at me like soldiers on parade. The army of death marching straight at me. It was the middle of July 1941. It got real cold, just like it be winter. Seemed like death himself reached out and touched me on the shoulder. He touched me just like I'm touching you. I got cold as ice, and death is standing there grinning at me. I say, what you want, Mr. Death? You be wanting me? You done brought your army to be getting me. I looked him dead in the eye. I wasn't fearing nothing. I was ready to tangle, just like I'm ready to tangle now. The Bible say be ever vigilant. That's why I don't get but so drunk. I gotta keep watch. Death standing there staring at me, carrying that sickle in his hand. Finally, he say, you want bound over for another year? See, just like that. You want bound over for another year? I told him, bound over hell. Let's settle this right now. He kind of fell back when I told him that. And all the cold went out me. And I reached out and I grabbed that sickle and I threw it just as far as I could throw it. And me and him commenced wrestling. We wrestled for 3 days and 3 nights. I can't say where I got the strength from. Every time it seemed like he was going to get the best of me, I reach way down deep inside myself and find the strength to do him one better. All right. At the end of the third night, we done weakened each other to where we could hardly move. Death stood up, threw on his robe. He had a white robe with a hood on it, and went off to look for his sickle. He say, "I'll be back," just like that. "I'll be back." I say, "Yeah, but you're gonna have to find me." I wasn't no fool. I wasn't going looking for him. Death ain't nothing to play with. I know he gonna get me. I know I gotta join his army, his camp followers. But as long as I keep up my strength to see him coming, as long as I keep up my vigilance, he gonna have to fight to get me, because I ain't going easy. Thank you.
Thank you all